You're standing in the pasta aisle, and it happens the same way every single time. Your hand reaches out almost automatically toward the familiar red jar sitting at eye level. The one with the confident smile on the label, the one with Italian script somewhere near the top, the one your family has grabbed without question for years. And in that moment of reaching, you feel something subtle but real. That quiet reassurance that comes from picking something you already know, something that's been in your kitchen before, something that feels safe. But what you're holding in your hand might not actually be what you believe it to be. That instinctive reach, that sense of certainty built from repetition and recognition, is exactly what the entire pasta sauce industry is counting on. And once you understand what's really happening in these jars, the way you shop this aisle becomes almost impossible to reverse. The pasta sauce aisle represents one of the most strategically misleading sections in any modern grocery store. I'm not saying there's outright fraud happening at the register or that brands are breaking laws in how they label things. What I'm saying is that the visual language of these jars has been deliberately engineered to bypass your conscious awareness of what you're actually purchasing. A burgundy label designed to evoke rustic Italian kitchens, a picture of bright red tomatoes prominently displayed on the front, claims about family recipes passed down through generations, references to authentic traditions. None of these visual choices are accidents. They are strategy. They are psychology applied to packaging. And they work so effectively that millions of shoppers grab the same sauce brands every single week, month after month, year after year, without ever reading past the first panel, without ever looking at what's actually listed in the ingredient section. This matters because pasta sauce is not some occasional luxury item that you buy once or twice a year when you're feeling fancy. It's a category where most American households purchase multiple jars per month. It's the foundation of weeknight dinners when you're too tired to cook from scratch. It's the base for school lunches and quick family meals. It's often the ingredient that determines whether a pasta dinner takes 45 minutes or 8 minutes. Which means if you're consistently buying the wrong sauce, and most people are, you're not just spending more money than necessary. You're not just making a neutral choice. You're actively feeding your family something that's been engineered to taste good and feel familiar, but doesn't actually contain what the branding implies and promises. Here's where this becomes genuinely important. When you're in that aisle, you're operating almost entirely on assumption. You see a jar that costs $3. You see another jar that costs $4.50. You see a third jar closer to $6. Your brain automatically maps this pricing spread onto a simple hierarchy. More expensive means better ingredients. More expensive means closer to what you remember from actual cooking in a real kitchen. More expensive means more tomato, less water, fewer shortcuts. But that price difference is not actually telling you about the quality or quantity of real tomatoes in the jar. It's telling you about marketing spend. It's telling you about jar size and label thickness. It's telling you how effectively that brand has convinced you that their version is somehow more authentic, more Italian, more family-made than all the others. The first brand that you should reconsider buying is Ragu. Now, Ragu is not a small niche brand with a devoted following among pasta purists. This is one of the largest selling pasta sauce brands in the entire United States. It's been available in grocery stores for decades. Millions of families have Ragu in their kitchen right now. When you read the ingredient list on a jar of Ragu, the first thing you notice is that tomato concentrate appears early in the list. But so do water and sugar. Lots of added sugar. The label on the front shows you bright red tomatoes, shows you that sense of harvest abundance, but when you look at the actual composition by weight, water is the second ingredient, water. Think about that for a moment. The primary things in that jar are tomato concentrate and water. You are literally buying a sauce where a significant portion of what you're paying for is water that could come from anywhere in the world. The sauce has a certain sweetness that keeps it palatable. But that sweetness is not coming from slow-cooked tomatoes that have been given time to naturally develop caramelization and depth of flavor. It's added sugar, and it's there doing a specific job, masking the fact that you're tasting more water and processed tomato concentrate than actual tomato fruit. What makes this particularly effective as a strategy is that Ragu carries the weight of decades of brand familiarity. Families bought it in the 1980s, and they still do. The brand is associated with stability and tradition, but the product itself has slowly transformed, moved, shifted away from anything resembling actual sauce making. The label still shows family, heritage, and Italian imagery meant to evoke authenticity. But the actual formula in the jar reflects a completely different priority: cost reduction and shelf-stable consistency. You're not paying for better tomatoes, you're paying for the reassurance that comes from repetition. The second brand worth reconsidering very carefully is Prego. This one sits right next to Ragu on the shelf, often at a similar price point, sometimes slightly higher. Prego's entire marketing strategy is built around the idea of a chunky, hearty sauce. All those visible tomato pieces on the label are supposed to signal real tomato fruit and natural texture. They're supposed to make you think of a sauce that's been simmered with care, where whole tomatoes have been broken down into pieces by time and heat. But when you look at the actual ingredient list, what you're reading is tomato puree, water, corn syrup, salt, and a list of added flavorings that includes onion powder, garlic powder, and various dried spices. The chunks you're seeing in the jar are real tomatoes, that part is true. But the base of the sauce, the substance that holds everything together and makes up the largest volume by weight, is more about emulsification and preservation than about letting tomato flavor be the dominant note. The corn syrup is particularly revealing. Corn syrup is cheaper than allowing natural tomato sugars to develop through cooking time. It provides a smooth, almost glossy mouthfeel that consumers have been trained, through years of commercial sauce exposure, to associate with quality and care. But that glossy feeling is not coming from slow cooking and reduction. It's coming from added sweetness and structural additives that coat your mouth in a specific way. The third brand that deserves serious scrutiny is Hunt's. Hunt's has positioned itself as the value option in the pasta sauce category. And to be fair, that positioning is somewhat honest, but what they're selling as value is not a recipe shortcut that still delivers on tomato sauce. It's a fundamental category shortcut. The ingredient list for Hunt's tomato sauce is almost brutally simple: tomato concentrate, water, salt, and spices. It costs less because there's almost nothing in there except tomato concentrate and water, and that's precisely the central problem. You're buying concentrated tomato soup. There's almost no actual tomato fruit in the jar. There's no real body. There's no depth. There's no actual food structure beyond dehydrated tomato solids that have been rehydrated with plain water. When you buy Hunt's, you're paying for something that tastes like tomatoes because tomato concentrate, by its nature, tastes like tomatoes in an intense, processed form. But you're not buying anything that resembles what actual tomato sauce making looks like. You're not buying something that took time, care, or quality ingredients. The fourth brand worth reconsidering is Victoria. Victoria sits in a slightly higher price tier than Hunt's or Ragu. The packaging is deliberately designed to evoke authenticity and restraint. It's a simple label. There's minimal graphic design, the kind of visual minimalism that's supposed to signal quality and careful curation. But the ingredient list reveals something quite different from what the packaging implies. Victoria does use real tomatoes and real tomato puree, which is better than some of its direct competitors. However, the sauce relies heavily on added oils for texture, starches for thickening, and sulfites for preservation. The price premium you're paying is not going entirely toward acquiring better tomatoes or better processing. Some of it is going toward the packaging aesthetic that makes you feel like you're buying something more authentic, more carefully made, more worth the extra money. Victoria has successfully created the visual language of quality without necessarily delivering quality in every section of the product. And the fifth brand that belongs on the list of ones to avoid is Classico. Classico has built its entire brand identity around a single word: traditional. The jar shows you a farmer. It shows you simplicity. It shows you the kind of rustic authenticity that American shoppers have been culturally trained to crave and value. But Classico is owned by the same parent company as several other major sauce brands, and the recipe reflects corporate efficiency more than traditional tomato sauce making from any actual tradition. The ingredient list includes modified cornstarch, several types of sugar, and a host of chemical preservatives. The sauce is engineered to sit on a shelf for months, sometimes approaching a year, without degrading. It's engineered to maintain a consistent texture across millions of jars, all tasting nearly identical to each other. It's engineered to appeal to the broadest possible consumer base, which means it can't be too acidic, can't be too simple, can't taste too much like one particular thing. What you're not getting is a sauce that tastes like someone's grandmother spent hours slowly cooking down real tomatoes in a kitchen. You're getting a product that's designed to feel like that happened, while being something entirely different. Now here's the critical piece that actually changes how you shop in this aisle. All 5 of these brands, Ragu, Prego, Hunt's, Victoria, and Classico, share a common underlying logic. They're all banking on the fact that you're not reading the ingredient list. They're all operating on the assumption that you'll make your purchasing decision based on the emotional language of the front label. They're all relying on tomato imagery, claims about family heritage, references to Italian tradition, promises of simplicity, and general appeals to authenticity. These things on the label are not descriptions of what's in the jar. They're marketing vectors designed to move you past the analytical part of your brain and into the emotional, habitual part. And the reason they work so consistently is because you're tired. You're moving quickly through the aisle. You've already bought these brands 100 times before, maybe 1,000 times. The reach is automatic. The shift in your shopping happens when you start actively looking for something completely different. The real pasta sauces, the ones made with actual tomatoes as the predominant ingredient, the ones with minimal added water, the ones with no added sugar, the ones with transparent sourcing and simple ingredient lists, these products exist on the same shelf. They're often in slightly different packaging because they don't need the elaborate visual reassurance that comes from complex label design and marketing messaging. They're often in smaller jars because the sauce is more concentrated. And they often cost more per jar, but when you do the math per actual serving of real sauce, the math changes dramatically. San Marzano tomatoes are the reference point for understanding what real sauce making actually looks like. San Marzano is a specific variety of tomato that grows in volcanic soil near Naples, Italy. These tomatoes have lower acidity than most other commercial tomato varieties. They have higher natural sugar content. They have a flavor profile that develops more complexity and depth when cooked down slowly. When a sauce is made from San Marzano tomatoes and almost nothing else, the ingredient list becomes almost absurdly short. Tomatoes, salt, maybe garlic, maybe basil, maybe a small amount of olive oil. That's the product. That's what you're buying. And when you taste it, the difference is immediate and undeniable. There's no added sweetness masking a thin, watery base. There's no glossy film from added oils or corn syrup. There's no thickening agent creating a texture that doesn't naturally occur in actual food. There's just actual tomato, concentrated and cooked. One of the best examples of this real tomato approach is Rao's. Rao's is positioned as a premium product, and the price reflects that positioning. A jar of Rao's can cost nearly double what you'd pay for ragu or prego. But the ingredient list is what fundamentally changes your understanding of value. The list says tomatoes, garlic, onions, olive oil, salt. That's essentially it. No water, no added sugar, no cornstarch for artificial thickening, no sulfites, no modified anything. The sauce is thick because it's made from actual tomatoes that have been slowly reduced over time, not because something chemical has been added to artificially thicken it. The flavor is complex because tomatoes, garlic, onions, and olive oil have been given actual time to develop together and meld, not because separate flavor compounds have been blended in a tank. You're tasting actual food. A second strong option is Pastine. Pastine has been making products for Italian-American cooking for over 100 years. The brand's core focus and expertise is tomato products. Their pasta sauce is made primarily from San Marzano tomatoes, with added garlic, oregano, and a minimal ingredient list that reads like a recipe rather than a chemistry experiment. Pastine does not try to sell you on heritage the way Classico does. They don't need to. They just make the product and let the simplicity and honesty of the ingredient list do the speaking. The jar is functional, not elaborate. The label is straightforward, not elaborate. The price is higher than Ragu or Hunt's, but it's significantly lower than Rao's. And the actual sauce, when you taste it, has substance and flavor complexity that comes directly from actual tomato fruit, not from engineering and additives. A third option that deserves serious attention is actually Victoria again, but specifically their line made with San Marzano tomatoes and minimal additives. And this is important to understand, not all Victoria products are created equal. Some of their sauces are exactly what was described earlier, the corporate efficiency model with added starches, oils, and preservatives. But Victoria also makes a separate product line that focuses on actual tomato fruit with minimal intervention. Reading the label becomes absolutely critical here, because the same brand name with slightly different packaging can mean a completely different product inside the jar. A fourth option worth exploring is BioNature. BioNature focuses on organic certification and minimal processing. The ingredient list is short: organic tomatoes, garlic, salt, spices, and a small amount of oil. Because the product is made from organic tomatoes that must meet specific cultivation standards, and because there's minimal added processing, the sauce naturally tastes more like concentrated tomato fruit than like an engineered product designed for shelf stability and broad appeal. BioNature doesn't spend heavily on marketing or elaborate packaging. The brand relies on the reputation it has built with people who specifically search for and value minimal ingredient products. And the fifth better option is Muir Glen. Muir Glen is also an organic brand, and their tomato sauce is made from organic tomatoes with a very simple recipe. The brand has achieved significant distribution in mainstream grocery stores, so finding it is not difficult. The ingredient list is straightforward and short. The price is reasonable and competitive. And the product itself doesn't try to be something it's not. It's tomato sauce made from tomatoes. When you taste it, you're getting the flavor of actual tomato fruit, not the flavor of sugar and tomato concentrate and various additives combined. Here's what's actually happening when you compare these two groups: the 5 to avoid and the 5 better options. The first group is operating from a central and explicit assumption. Consumers are not reading ingredient lists, and they're making purchase decisions based on visual signaling and brand familiarity and emotional association. So the entire product has been engineered backward from that assumption. Marketing comes first in the design process. The actual ingredient list is secondary. The nutritional value is tertiary. The 5 better options are operating from a completely different assumption. The people buying this product want actual tomato sauce. They're willing to pay a bit more. They're willing to read a label. They care about real ingredients. So the marketing is minimal because the ingredient list itself becomes the marketing. This reveals something important about how you actually become a more informed shopper in this category. You cannot rely on the front label to tell you the truth. You cannot rely on price alone to indicate quality. You cannot rely on brand familiarity and the fact that you've bought something 100 times before. You cannot rely on packaging design, heritage imagery, family recipes, Italian references, or any of the emotional language that these brands spend millions upon millions of dollars to create and distribute. The only reliable information in the entire transaction is the ingredient list on the back. When you're standing in the aisle, here's the actual decision-making framework that changes everything. First, look at the ingredient list. Tomato fruit, whether that's whole tomatoes, crushed tomatoes, or tomato puree made directly from tomatoes, should be the first ingredient listed, not tomato concentrate, not water, actual tomato fruit. Second, count the total number of ingredients. If the list is longer than 8 or 9 items, you're buying something that's been engineered for long shelf stability and maximum broad appeal, not something that's been made with the intention of tasting like tomato sauce. Third, look for added sugars of any kind. Sugar, corn syrup, high fructose corn syrup, or any sweetening agent that appears on the list means the product relies on added sweetness to mask other compromises and shortcuts. Fourth, check carefully to see if water appears early in the ingredient list. If water appears high on the list, you're buying diluted sauce. If tomato solids appear much later in the list, that concentration came from processing, not from time and cooking heat. Once you apply this framework consistently, the decision becomes almost automatic and almost unconscious. You move through the aisle with a clear sense of what you're looking for. You walk past the familiar jars with the colorful labels and the heritage imagery. You find the sauces where the ingredient list reads like a recipe that an actual human could make at home. And the difference in price, which initially seemed confusing, with premium products costing nearly double the cost of mass market options, suddenly makes perfect sense. You're not paying for marketing and packaging and the cost of celebrity endorsements. You're paying directly for actual tomatoes. There's a specific sensory moment that happens when you switch from the engineered commercial sauces to the real tomato sauces for the first time. You open a jar of Rouse or Pastine or Muir Glen for the first time, and the smell is immediate and completely different from what you're used to. It smells like tomato, not like sweetness masked with tomato flavoring, not like tomato concentrate mixed with water and corn syrup and spices, just like tomato fruit that's been cooked down. When you taste it, the texture is different. It's thicker without being glossy. It has body without additives providing that body artificially. The flavor develops over the few minutes it takes to warm it up on the stove. The garlic becomes more pronounced. The acidity of the tomato becomes clearer and more present. The salt becomes balanced with everything else. It tastes like something that took actual time to make, not like something that was mixed in an industrial tank and then poured into millions of jars for shelf stability. That sensory difference is not subjective preference or acquired taste. It's the actual difference between a product made from real tomato fruit and a product made from tomato concentrate, water, and added compounds designed to engineer the sensation of quality. Once you taste that difference clearly, going back to Ragu or Prego or Hunt's becomes noticeably difficult. Not because you've suddenly developed expensive taste or become a snob, but because you're tasting the actual product you're supposed to be buying, and you can't really unhear that information. The deeper issue here is that pasta sauce is not unique in this dynamic. This same framework applies across dozens of product categories in the grocery store. Across every aisle, you have the engineered versions that rely primarily on marketing and visual signaling, and you have the transparent versions that rely on actual ingredients being good enough to speak for themselves. The only real difference is learning to consistently look past the front label and read what's actually in the container. When you make the switch to real tomato sauces, you'll notice something else that changes the economics of the decision. You use less sauce per serving because it's more concentrated. A jar of Rouse or Pastine or Muir Glen goes further across more servings than a jar of Ragu or Prego because there's less water diluting the actual tomato content. Which means even though the per jar price is higher, the per serving cost often ends up being similar or even lower than the cheaper options. You're not actually spending significantly more money. You're just spending it differently, spending it on actual food, instead of spending it on water and marketing and shelf stability and broad appeal engineering. The 5 brands to avoid are not going anywhere. They're too entrenched in the market. They're too widely distributed across grocery chains. They're too familiar. Parents who bought Ragu in 1985 are still buying it in 2025, and they're passing the habit to their children. But knowing what these products actually contain changes your entire understanding of your own choices. You can choose to buy them, and honestly, sometimes you will. Convenience matters, price matters, availability matters, habit matters. But you'll be choosing them with full awareness of what you're actually getting. You'll be buying Ragu knowing it's mostly water and sugar. You'll be buying Hunt's knowing it's tomato concentrate soup. You'll be buying Prego knowing it's mostly corn syrup and thickeners. That's different from buying them thinking you're getting real sauce made with care and real tomato fruit. And once you've tasted the alternative, once you understand what real pasta sauce actually tastes like, once you see how short a real ingredient list can be, the decision becomes easier every single time. You start reaching for Rouse or Pastine or Muir Glen instead. You move past the familiar jars with the confident smiles and the heritage claims. And over the course of a year, over multiple jars purchased, over dozens of pasta dinners, that one different choice in the pasta aisle accumulates. You've fed your family better sauce. You've spent your money more directly on actual food instead of on marketing and water and additives. And you've proven to yourself that you're capable of reading past the marketing and making an actual choice based on what's really in the product, not based on what the packaging wants you to feel. The pasta sauce aisle is a perfect representation of how modern grocery shopping actually works. It's not primarily about finding the absolute best product in the world. It's about resisting the engineered confidence of familiar branding and doing the simple work of reading an ingredient list. The jars sitting on the shelf right now, the ones you've bought 100 times, the ones that feel safe and familiar, they're betting that you won't do that work. They're betting that you'll grab them out of habit. They're betting that you won't look at the back. But now you know the difference. Now you know what to look for. Now, when you make that reach in the aisle, it's not just a habit, it's an actual choice. What's your experience been with pasta sauce? Have you made the switch, or are you still buying the brands you've always bought? And more importantly, what other product categories have you realized you might be buying based on marketing and habit instead of actual ingredients? That's the real pattern worth discussing, and that's the conversation I want to hear about in the comments.